Good morning and thank you so much for joining us for this edition of Eye on New Mexico. This past week, news from northern New Mexico shocked our state and the country. 11 children were rescued from a Taos County compound. Officials say they were living in deplorable, filthy conditions. Court documents say the kids were undergoing training to commit school shootings. 5 adults are in custody, and authorities say the remains of a small child were also found in the compound. Our Ryan Laughlin was one of the first at the site, and he spoke to landowners who say this camp was illegally built on their property, and they're frustrated that something wasn't done sooner.
Watch your footing. There's a lot of holes and everything's covered.
Tanya and Jason Badger have been dealing with
this is their bathroom, I guess.
This since this winter. The Army veteran couple bought this 10-acre plot with the plan of building a getaway cottage.
I don't know if that's human feces or animal ones.
Instead, it's been turned into a third-world-looking compound hiding just south of the Colorado-New Mexico border. And the discoveries on the lot,
brutal fight enders. That's promising.
Are chilling.
Lots of bullet casings.
There's bullet casings in there.
A shooting range in the back, shattered glass fence in the front, mini crayons scattered about, and live ammunition. One detail that was not released initially by the Taos County Sheriff's is that there was a 150-foot escape tunnel in this compound. This hole here goes into the earth 150 feet. There's a ladder at the end of this, and the owners say they believe it could be used as an escape route. Cross another property line and you'll find the exit to that tunnel. 11 kids were living in these conditions for months. The landowners say Lucas Morton and Suraj Wahaj mistakenly set up camp on their lot sometime after Christmas. They owned the lot directly behind the Badgers' land, and for months they've been either trying to sell their land or kick them out. All attempts have failed. But to the Badgers, their land is the less important concern.
Where else could he, if he's not with them, where is he?
Abdul Kahani Wahaj is the 3-year-old boy that police say was abducted from his home in Georgia at the beginning of December. Police have arrested his father on suspicion of child abduction, but the little boy...
It's not fair. You know, kids can't fight for themselves.
...is still nowhere to be found. From Taos County, Ryan Laughlin, KOB Eyewitness News 4.
And as you saw, the images were really heartbreaking from that compound. The county sheriff called the living conditions for those 11 kids the saddest that he ever saw. So where do those children go from here? We sat down with COAFD Cabinet Secretary Monique Jacobson to see what's next for those children.
We also will look to do medical assessments. They also will often do what are called forensic interviews, where we have trained interviewers that will meet with the kids and talk to the kids to try to get as much information as possible as to what these children, any children, have experienced in their lives and what was going on in their homes.
Jacobson says the goal is to get the kids into a foster home as soon as possible. And the serious charges against the suspects have rocked our state and the entire country, but none more so than the small community of Amalia, north of Taos, where the compound was found. Our Cassie Nelson spoke with people there the other day.
This small town of Amalia is quiet until...
No, I still have them in the freezer. Oh.
You walk through the doors of the Amalia Senior Center come lunchtime. Most of these people have lived here their entire lives, and they've known each other for just about as long, too. This is where they meet every day to share a meal and conversation.
For the camaraderie, they pool, play bingo, and visit with the ladies, give them static or whatever.
A popular topic among these folks,
the drought,
has turned to something a little more difficult to talk about.
My heart goes out to those kids, so I can say.
Knowing now about the investigation into horrific child abuse claims down the road changes their conversation to something they never thought they'd be talking about here.
We see what happens in Albuquerque, all over the nation. How could this happen to us? But hey, only God knows. That's the way I see it.
Some say they'd seen the suspects out, but nothing seemed off.
You see them down the road. Sometimes you see them at the store, you know, like we all do. Hi, how you doing? How's everything? That's about it.
Others had no idea the secrets that were being kept just a couple miles away.
It's very sad the way things turned out. And it's real peaceful here all the time. We never hear about anything happening here, you know. But it's not scary anymore.
Cassie Nelson, KLB, Eyewitness News 4.
And this investigation began with a search for 3-year-old Abdul Ghani Wahaj. Officers say his father, Siraj Wahaj, took the boy from their home in Georgia back in December. But Abdul was not one of the 11 children rescued. The Taos County Sheriff's Office did find the remains of a child buried within that compound. Abdul's grandfather told reporters in New York the body belongs to his grandson. But the Office of the Medical Investigator here in New Mexico has not confirmed that. OMI said it could take a while because the remains are so severely decomposed. And we spoke with one of the suspects, Lucas Morton's father. He actually disrupted court proceedings, shouting at the judge in Arabic this week. We spoke with him after, and he gave us our first glimpse as to why these 5 people were in New Mexico to begin with.
The situation that drove them there is a very similar situation to most of Americans. The society separates, and my son and his companion were a part of that separation. You know, they tried to fit in, they tried to work normal jobs. You know, it just wasn't working with society.
Gerard Jabril Abduwali says he hasn't seen his son Lucas Morton in a year and hasn't communicated with him since December, but he did offer this.
All they wanted to do is to get out of society, get away, homestead, and live a peaceful life.
Well, law enforcement now believes the arsenal of weapons found on the compound was used for school shooting training. Morton's father disagrees.
Weapons are, you know, not legal in some places. They are used to for protection. And when you are traveling with women and children, you need to protect yourself.
Here's what we know specifically about Siraj Abin Wahaj. In 2006, he was living in Brooklyn, New York. We uncovered a lawsuit where he alleged after arriving from Morocco, a border protection officer at JFK Airport illegally stopped, profiled, and targeted him because he is a Muslim. Siraj Abin Wahaj's father is a famous imam who preaches in Brooklyn. One published report connected the father to the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, but he was never indicted. As far as these 3 women go, Taos Muslim leader Latifah Weinman met with the women in jail. She told us Tuesday the women had one request.
I went to the prison yesterday. I spoke to the women to see what they needed. They wanted Qurans. It's like somebody asking for the Bible.
And that was Chris Ramirez reporting. So my guest today is Dr. Scott Carroll. He is a psychologist here, and we're talking about a very traumatic experience for almost all the children here involved. 11 of them ages from 1 to 15. What kind of road to recovery is there for these children?
Fortunately, the road is actually quite good now that they're out of the dangerous situation. Now, obviously, this is going to take time. But what we can expect is that, focusing on their immediate physical needs in terms of like food, clothing, shelter, water, that's a good start. And then having a safe environment and allowing them to connect to the new adults that will be taking care of them in their lives will certainly help that process. Now, they may have to deal with formal mental illnesses because possibly they were exposed to quite traumatic events. And then, of course, even when your caregivers are involved in inappropriate activities, and even if your caregivers were not sort of taking care of you in the best way possible, there is still a recovery process involved in that. So they may have to do a fair amount of healing from their past experiences, possibly traumatic, but also just being separated from their caregivers is a form of trauma. And so we know that human children naturally attach to caregivers even when caregivers are not perfect, and even when caregivers sometimes are abusive to the children. So, it's not like there's no attachment there at all. Children still love their parents, even when the parents, have been abusive to them. Mm-hmm. So it's still a very big loss to lose one's parents, whether it's, to death, to jail, abandonment, whatever it is.
Wow. And we're seeing a wide range from 1 through 15 here. Will it be different in terms of the treatment time for the younger kids versus the older kids to deal with these traumatic experiences?
Yes. Interestingly enough, most likely you're going to have the ones at the extremes, you're going to have the best recovery process. The 1-year-old, because was exposed to less of the traumatic events, or presumably traumatic events, and the 15-year-old may have only been exposed in the latter part of their life, in the last year. So, they may have more of a good foundation, if you will, to build upon and recover with. You worry more about the children in the middle. Though obviously, every child is different. We're all unique as humans, and so our recovery journey can be quite variable based on, our own individual factors.
The court documents allege that these children were undergoing school shooting training. How can the process to help children get away from that, how does that work out?
Well, one of the things is just normalizing environment. So, normal everyday life, and even life, in a foster care home is very therapeutic because there's a normality to it where it's, eating breakfast, sleeping every night in a comfortable bed, going to school every day. As mundane as those things seem to be, they actually are very good for us as humans.
What about community trauma? I mean, people here in their own backyards finding out that this has happened here, not too far away from them. What kind of trauma will they experience because of this?
One of the things to think about is that, when we see the news and we watch sort of traumatic events, it really makes us think that, oh my goodness, the world is a dangerous place. Though if you talk to historians and researchers, while the world is still dangerous, it's actually never been safer. And so what I would say to people is try to understand that this is an isolated event, that it's not something that happens routinely. Obviously, this is why it made the news and why we're here talking, because it's unusual. So recognize the rarity of this and try not to worry that the world is not quite so, dangerous and there's, danger lurking behind every corner. And it's very important to remind yourself of that fact.
All right. Okay, so when it comes to, telling children about these types of events or seeing this on the news, with about a minute left, how do we approach the subject with our younger kids who are seeing this or hearing about stuff like this?
One of the things is to reassure them that they're safe, and that this was, a rare thing that happened, and that this is not anything you're going to go do, as a parent, that you're not going to go take them off to the wilderness and try to camp in, very substandard conditions. And also, I would avoid leaving the news on around young children, especially under about 10, because they lack the cognitive capacity to really understand intellectually what's going on. And so they will mistakenly assume that, oh, that's just, nearby, or that's something that can happen to almost anyone, where in reality, it's a very rare event.
All right, so that's going to do it for this segment of Eye on New Mexico. We're going to be back and we're going to broaden the conversation and talk about negative childhood experiences and how it could affect the kids here in our state. We'll be back after the break. Welcome back. This past week's news from northern New Mexico shocked our state and the country. 11 children were rescued from a Taos County compound, and officials say they were living in deplorable, filthy conditions. Court documents say the kids were undergoing training to commit school shootings. 5 adults are in custody, and authorities say the remains of a small child were also found in that compound. In our last segment, we talked about this, but it brings us to a much broader issue about adverse childhood experiences. A national report by Child Trends, using data from the National Survey of Children's Health, shows New Mexico has some of the highest rates of children suffering from adverse childhood experiences, ACEs. Those are traumatic childhood events, and they include suffering abuse and neglect, living with someone who has an untreated mental illness, those who have experienced the death of a parent, or those living in extreme economic insecurity. So joining us again with this conversation is Dr. Scott Carroll. He is a psychologist here. So tell us about ACEs. We kind of just listed what are some of those things. How is a problem here in New Mexico affecting our children?
So ACEs stands for Adverse Childhood Event, and there's a large research body about these types of events that have been shown. It was originally actually done to look at long-term medical outcomes, and so they look at like length of life, dangerous behaviors like smoking, drinking, substance use, being sedentary, and so the original research actually looked at medical outcomes, and they're obviously very negative. And of course, this research was mostly done through Kaiser Permanente, which is a very large health maintenance organization, mostly in California and on the West Coast. So this research was actually done on people who have private insurance, who work jobs, and it clearly showed very strong negative indicators around that. Now, the research has been expanded and looking more at mental health outcomes, and of course, not surprisingly, the mental health outcomes are very negative as well for children. And this is looking at how they function as adults. And so some of these events are things like, death of a parent, incarceration of a parent, as well as, things like bullying and other negative, events. And so obviously these are of course, very negative things. And what's interesting is the research just looked at how many negative events did you have, and the more you have, just your risks just dramatically increased. And part of the problem is that many of these negative events are associated, with poverty and, poor economic standards. And so, in New Mexico, which we have a lot of poverty, and we have some of the highest number of children growing up in poverty of any state in the nation. Usually we're second only to Mississippi in that regard. So we're at high risk for these. Now, on the positive side, I will say, as a child psychiatrist, and the fact that I practice, I've practiced almost my entire career here in New Mexico, there are many positive cultural factors that we have in New Mexico. One of them being the strong family focus here. And so while in many ways, while our numbers look very bad, we actually do better than you would expect because of these protective factors that we have. Most often being very strong extended families and very strong cohesive focus on the family here.
So when a child does experience one of the ACEs that we had listed here in this segment, how many of them does a child have to go through for it to affect them long term? I mean, is there a certain number of ACEs out there that, if they experience the death of a parent or economic insecurity, that their chances of, long term effects could affect them in the future?
So when you exceed 5, so the research says when you get 5 or higher, you are at the highest risk category. So a lot of it does vary. What I can say is that, even if you have a number of risk factors, if you do have some consistency with just a single caregiver, whether it's an aunt, an uncle, a grandparent, it just takes one good person to really mitigate a lot of those negative effects. And so, that's why it's so important, like in terms of extended family, because I work extensively with, grandparents, aunts and uncles who have taken care of children and do amazing jobs. So while it's a negative thing, whatever the negative event, the child has experienced before that, just remember that, children have tremendous resiliency, and that if you can change, the negative environment and put them in a good environment with someone who cares and loves them and will be with them consistently, you can turn around a lot of these negative events.
Is this something that, caregivers, adults who are watching over these children need to address immediately when they're kids? Say they went through some sort of traumatic experience, do they let it sit for a while, or do they just respond to it with going to a mental health professional?
I would say, don't wait on seeing the mental health professional. And given that there aren't a large number of mental health professionals that work with children in our state, the wait list to get started is quite lengthy. So what I would say is, while, being consistent and present and patient with the child is a good start, don't hesitate to seek the mental health care, because it may take us a while to get you in and to see you.
Now, talking about the access to getting the help for these kids, what is that like here in our state? You mentioned there's a long wait list, but we have a really rural state where we've got other communities. What needs to be done to increase access?
Well, we need to recruit more professionals. That's the first thing to say. There is also the issue that we have the problem with, most professionals are concentrated in the urban areas of our state. So if you're in a rural area, and the children do tend to be much more rural than urbanized like the adult population is, and so we really use various forms of technology like telemedicine, where we use basically video conferencing to provide services to children in other parts of the state. So and there are, I know people at the state level that are working on modifying some of the laws and regulations around that to make it easier for us to take advantage of that facility. We also have programs like the ECHO project, where professionals like myself who specialize in doing one thing support the primary care doctors, the pediatricians, the general practitioners, and therapists in the communities to work with children. So even though they may not have the specialized training, we can give them the support so they can do those things. Also, I see patients from all over the state. For certain types of services, it's reasonable for them to travel, the 3 or 4 hours it takes to get here to receive, certain parts of their care here in Albuquerque.
So how do these ACEs affect someone, later in life?
Well, one of the things you see is that negative effects on like relationships, career development, but especially things like smoking, alcohol use, substance use, and healthcare behaviors like not taking care, overeating, being sedentary, not exercising appropriately, which then leads to negative long-term health effects like diabetes, obesity, heart disease, things like that.
So when a parent is taking care of a child and their child has experienced some adverse events, what are some things to look out for that they think, okay, this is a red flag, I need to get this child some help?
That's a great question. So I'll break it up by age, because it does look different in each age. So under 5, so kindergarten and younger, you typically just see increased tantrums, where they'll start just melting down over little things where they wouldn't before. So that's a big clue. Other thing you watch for is like if they suddenly start bedwetting or urinating or defecating in inappropriate places, which is kind of an unusual one, but that is another sign that a child is distressed, especially if it's something new. Elementary school age children, they will also have more tantrums, more irritability. You'll see them doing things like if you tell them to turn off the video game, instead of just kind of whining about it, which is normal, they actually have a complete meltdown and just roll and cry on the floor. They can't handle that loss or that limit. So that's a big clue right there. You also will see elementary school children avoiding friends, not wanting to go out to ride their bike, or doing normal activities like that. They may want to watch more TV, may crave sweets more, things like that. And then of course, once you get into like middle and high school, you see more typical responses like adults, where like grades will drop. That's a big clue, that their grades start dropping. If they start hanging out with a different crowd of friends, they may start avoiding fun activities. Like if they're on a sports team, they may quit it, or may quit cheerleading or some club that they're really into. You see any kind of experimentation with like substances, alcohol, marijuana, other things like that. Those are other strong signs that the child is not doing well, the adolescent is not doing well.
So then do parents have to, or other caregivers, act quickly in terms of getting them seen? How do they go about that process of starting to normalize the behavior?
Well, the first thing is to not just assume it's a phase. On rare occasions, do I meet with a child and tell the parents, really they're fine, there's nothing really wrong, this is just sort of a normal developmental phase. Maybe about 1 in 100 children I see. Most of the time, by the time they get to see me or my colleagues, there is a real legitimate issue. And so, and even if it is a developmental, there's a developmental process, being an adolescent and growing up is still very challenging. So even if something is normal, that doesn't make it easy. And as mental health professionals, we can certainly help normal transitions too. So there's a lot we can do, even if something doesn't quite rise to the level of a formal diagnosis.
So after their childhood and they're in their adulthood and they've experienced these ACEs, how long will they need to see a mental health professional? Is it something that they can go for a while, or is this a long-term type of process to deal with events?
So one of the things I understand is that children are actually much easier to treat than adults. And so while I'm just saying hypothetically, an adult might take 10 years, 5 or 10 years of therapy to really get over something, children you think more like 2 to 3 years. But a lot of it is, consistency and then just doing everything you can to sort of improve the home environment. I talked about that resiliency that you get from having just one good adult who cares about you. And I've had a number of patients over the years, that will, while they may have challenges that we worked on, there was a grandmother or there was an aunt or an uncle, somebody who really cared about them and paid attention to them and was present for them. Did a great thing.
So what does our state need to do? I know that you said recruiting is a big thing. Are there any other increases in programs or services that need to be looked at or addressed to help these children with ACEs?
So, well, obviously we don't have an abundance of funding for mental health, given the economy of our state. But what I think we can do is in terms of improving training and recruiting people here, because we have, believe it or not, I get job offers daily, multiple job offers daily to go everywhere else in the country, even internationally. So, I'm here because I want to be here. And part of that thing is, I came here for training at UNM. I did my training at, University Hospital, and I fell in love with the state. I'm not from New Mexico, but being here for training is what, made me love this state, made me want to be here and make this my home. And so I think that's where it's so important to support UNM in their training programs, because, almost every child psychiatrist that practices in New Mexico trained at UNM. About 80% of us did. And so if you think about it, it's not just training people at UNM, it's also your best recruitment tool too.
All right. Well, thank you so much for stopping by and talking to us about these issues here that our state faces. That's going to do it for this episode of Eye on New Mexico. We'll be back next weekend with another edition. Thanks so much.